We all know Invincible is one of the biggest superhero shows of the century, with some even calling it the best of all time. But what most people don't realize is just how many disturbing hidden details are buried beneath all the action. Details that make the show even more twisted than it already is. Let's start with the slightly uncomfortable and slowly work our way up to the darkest, most disturbing horrors in the series. Mark's lotion. In Season 1, Episode 3, Mark Grayson was still adjusting to his new life as Invincible, while also trying to balance high school, family, and most importantly, his crush on Amber. After countless awkward moments, Mark finally mustered the courage to ask her out. To his surprise, she said yes. And before he knew, Amber was set to come over to his house that same night. But before she arrived, Mark did something we can say fairly interesting. As the camera panned across to his room, Mark can be seen casually tossing a bottle of lotion and some tissues into the trash, a detail so quick most missed. But I think we both know that there's only one reason that those would be sitting on his desk. At the time, it was just a quick background detail, easy to brush off. But hilariously, in a later scene, after Amber breaks up with him, those same tissues and lotion ended up back on the desk. After everything Mark had been through, getting beaten half to death, losing Amber, barely holding his life together, yeah, let's just say is that he was about to give his right arm a character arc of its own. The skeletons. Darkwing, the city's lone protector, was a skilled vigilante who fought crime from the shadows. With his cape, gadgets, and brooding presence, he was Invincible's version of Batman, if Batman didn't have any plot armor. Unlike other superheroes, Darkwing was just a regular guy who decided jumping off rooftops was a solid career choice. He relied on strategy and his mind, which was great, until it wasn't. Back in Season 1, he stopped 2 burglars mid-robbery, but instead of handing them over to the police, he tied them up and left them hanging from a pipe high above the city, telling them he'd be back to check on them tomorrow. That promise was never kept, however, as the very next time we saw Darkwing, he was brutally killed by Omni-Man. With Midnight City's hero gone, the criminals he left behind were forgotten. Fast forward to Season 2, Episode 2, when Invincible visits Midnight City. In the background, the same 2 burglars are still hanging there, except now only their skeletons remain. Multipaul's prison break. We can't talk about disturbing without mentioning what happened in Stronghold Penitentiary in Season 3, Episode 5. The scene starts in a prison, one not just for regular criminals, but built to hold the worst superpowered threats, and Multipaul was one of them. You see, Paul's ability allows him to multiply endlessly as long as he's awake, and that made him nearly impossible to contain. After getting arrested for a heist gone wrong, where he flooded the city with clones and nearly overwhelmed the heroes, he was locked up in a specialized cell designed to keep him controlled. But Multipaul had a devious plan to get out. For weeks, he acted weak, barely moving, barely speaking. The guards got lazy, then when they eased up on him, it was finally time to make his move. At first, he created just a few clones, silent, unmoving, stacked in the shadows. The security cameras didn't catch anything unusual, but soon, there were more. 5, 10, 50. The cell got tighter and tighter, bodies pressing against the walls. But while all eyes were on his clones, the real Multipaul quietly climbed up to the ceiling, hiding in the shadows, waiting for what he knew would happen next. By the time the guards noticed something was off, it was already too late. The entire cell exploded instantly, walls collapsing under pressure as his clones filled the interior. The force of the explosion sent bodies flying, alarms started blaring, security quickly rushed in with their weapons drawn. But within seconds, every clone was crushed under the weight of the explosion, bodies torn apart, blood covering the floor, and as the dust settled, the real Multipaul calmly stepped over the remains, walking out unharmed. The plan had worked perfectly. Multipaul was free, but for how long? Time seemed to stop as the whole prison stared in shock. Guards, inmates, cameras. However, Multipaul didn't waste a second. He slipped through the mess, dodging guards and weaving through the fight. He knew he had to move fast before they had a chance to react, but by this time, they were ready for him. Before he could multiply again, a guard lunged forward and slapped a power dampening collar around his neck, stopping Multipaw from multiplying further. Biplane's corpse. Biplane was never the kind of guy to play it safe. He lived for trouble, always pulling off crazy moves just to prove he could. But in Season 1, Episode 1, he took things way too far. Strapped with a bomb and ready to cause destruction, he made one final mistake, challenging the Immortal. Without hesitation, the Immortal grabbed him and in one ruthless move, tossed him into space like he was nothing. Most people probably forgot about him after that, but if you pay close attention in Episode 4, the show slips in one of the creepiest hidden details. As Mark drifts through space, something floats silently in the background. It's easy to miss, but when you look closer, it's clear. It's Biplane, his frozen body trapped in the emptiness of space. A chilling reminder of a life wasted on reckless choices. Bulletproof kills his own parents. In Invincible number 97, Zandel Rudolph, also known as Bulletproof, shared the heartbreaking and violent story of his past. He grew up in the shadow of his genius twin brother Tyrone, who was obsessed with superhero DNA. Tyrone's obsession led him to use Zandel as a test subject in dangerous experiments to unlock superpowers. One of those experiments worked, giving Zandel super strength, but it also caused an explosion that killed Tyrone. Instead of believing it was an accident, Zandel's parents blamed him for their son's death and accused him of murder. Things got even worse when Zandel's girlfriend, overwhelmed and desperate, struck Miss Rudolph with a pan, killing her on the spot. Mr. Rudolph, furious and out for revenge, went after Zandel. In the heat of the moment, as the fight got out of control, Zandel panicked and in self-defense used his new strength, snapping his father's neck instantly. That night changed everything, but it wasn't just a tragic turning point. It was the moment Zandel truly became bulletproof. With both parents gone and years of pain and abuse behind him, he was left to carry the weight of his choices and the damage caused by his family's obsession with power. But Zandel wasn't the only one whose life was destroyed by power, because PowerPlex electrocutes his own family too. In Invincible Season 3 Episode 6, we see a family destroyed in one of the most heartbreaking ways possible. PowerPlex, once a loving husband and father, loses everything, not because of some outside force, but because of his own uncontrollable power. His hatred for Invincible wasn't random, it came from a deep, unbearable loss. When Invincible fought Omni-Man in Chicago, the city was torn apart, leaving behind nothing but rubble and death. PowerPlex's family was among the countless lives lost that day. In his eyes, Invincible wasn't a hero, he was a reckless force of destruction, responsible for the mess that took everything from him. Fueled by grief and rage, PowerPlex made it his mission to bring Invincible down, no matter the cost. That obsession led to the fateful confrontation in Episode 6. PowerPlex finally got his chance to fight Invincible, unleashing everything he had. But in the heat of the battle, blinded by his own fury, he lost control. His powers lashed out wildly, and in one horrifying instant, his wife and baby son were caught in the blast. The very people he still had left, the only ones he was truly fighting for, were gone. And the way they died was beyond tragic. The electricity tore through them, leaving nothing but silence. Evil Invincible's cannibalism. This is one of the most disturbing and horrifying moments in Invincible, a scene that sticks with you long after reading it. It involves alternate versions of Mark Grayson, twisted, broken, reflections of the hero that we know who were trapped in a dead universe with no way out, no food, and no hope. This nightmare began when Angstrom Levy, a villain with the ability to open portals to different dimensions, tried to destroy Invincible, but his plan didn't go as expected. Instead of simply eliminating him, Levy ended up stranding multiple evil Invincible variants in an alternate universe, a barren wasteland with nothing to eat or drink. At first, they clung to the hope that they'd find a way back, but as days turned to weeks, starvation and desperation took over. With no other choice, they did the unthinkable. One by one, the weaker versions of Invincible were hunted down and eaten. What started as a fight for survival quickly turned into something much darker, something even primal. By the time Primarch, the main version of Invincible, discovered what had happened, only two were left, Sinister Mark and Mohawk Mark. Mohawk Mark, shaken and disgusted, confessed to the horrors they had committed. He hated what he had done, but starvation left him no choice. The idea of eating his own kind sickened him, but he needed to survive. In the end, he found a bizarre alternative, using his own sweat as sustenance. A method so strange yet effective that it made one thing painfully clear. There had been another way to survive all along. These guys went full horror movie mode, eating versions of themselves, when all along, one of them could have just licked his own arm? I mean, it's beyond messed up. The train scene. To get into some of the darkest scenes of the series, we must revisit none other than the Season 1 finale where Omni-Man's true nature was fully revealed. By this point, we all know that Omni-Man, Mark's father, wasn't the hero he pretended to be. But it was in this brutal fight with Mark that the extent of his cruelty truly came to light. Up until then, Mark still believed he could reason with his father. He thought that there had to be some part of him that still cared. But Omni-Man had other plans. He wasn't just trying to beat Mark, he was trying to break him. Physically, mentally, and emotionally. And he did it in the worst way possible. After already beating Mark half to death, Omni-Man decided it wasn't enough. He needed Mark to truly understand how powerless he was. So instead of punching him again, he did something far worse. They were in a subway tunnel, and a train was speeding towards them. But Omni-Man wasn't trying to escape the train. He grabbed Mark, held him in place, and let the entire train smash into them. The result was absolute carnage. The train didn't just crash, it exploded in a storm of metal, glass, and people. And since Mark is practically invincible, he didn't get ripped apart. Everyone else except him and his dad did. People were splattered instantly, their bodies crushed and torn apart as they slammed into Mark at full speed. Blood painted the entire tunnel, faces twisted in horror, frozen in the final moments before impact. It was one of the goriest, most haunting scenes in the entire show. And the worst part was that Mark couldn't do anything but watch. His father forced him to experience it all, to feel the weight of every single innocent life lost. However, as horrifying as the train scene was, at least Omni-Man's brutality had a purpose, as twisted as it was. Anissa's despicable act. Of all the ruthless Viltrumites, few were as despised as Anissa. She was one of the most hated characters in Invincible, and in just a second, you'll understand exactly why. At first, she seemed like another loyal Viltrumite, strong, arrogant, and ruthless, but she took things to a whole new level of cruelty. The first time we saw her, Mark was out on a date with Amber, finally enjoying a rare moment of peace. Then, out of nowhere, Anissa appeared, grabbed Amber, and threatened to kill her if Mark didn't cooperate. She dragged him into the sky and laid it all out. The Viltrum Empire wanted him to join them, or Earth would be wiped out. Mark refused, and Anissa wasn't happy, but she let him go, after beating his ass, of course. 6 months passed, and she was back, and this time, she didn't want to talk. She found Mark again, but barely gave him a chance to speak. The Viltrumites had a problem. There were only about 50 full-blooded Viltrumites left in the universe, and repopulation was a top priority. She admitted she hadn't been doing her part, but now she had decided that Mark would be the one to help her fix that. Mark immediately tried to leave, but she blocked his path, making it clear she wasn't asking. She never wanted to mate with a human, but since he was a Viltrumite, she'd settle for him. Mark refused, saying he was with Eve and tried to fly away, but before he could escape, Anissa slammed her forehead into his, sending him reeling. Persuasion wasn't going to work, so she forced herself on him. Mark fought back, hoping she'd back off, but she didn't. If anything, she enjoyed the struggle. Anissa easily caught his punch before throwing him down to the ground. They crashed onto a deserted farm, the impact shaking the earth beneath them. Mark tried to get up, but she was already on top of him, pressing his arms down with an unshakable grip. He kept resisting, but she barely even acknowledged his struggle. With one elbow digging into his neck, she kept him pinned. He pleaded for her to stop, but she didn't listen. She reached down, and Mark could only watch in horror as she tore off their costumes and raped him. Traumatized and powerless, he began to cry, but Anissa didn't care. She mocked him, told him to man up, and then left like nothing crazy had happened. As if that wasn't enough, she came back later with a baby, the result of the assault, a son named Marky. Somehow, she expected Mark to co-parent with her like none of it had ever happened. This ends up being one of the most darkest and disturbing moments in Invincible history. Speaking of traumatization, if you made it this far without flinching, congrats, you got a stronger stomach than Mark did. But if you don't, then hit that subscribe button. Who knows, you might just wake up to Anissa at your door.